Say your name and your age and,
Oh,
yeah.
well, for those that don't know me, I'm Norman Phillips. I'll be 91 November 29th. Luckily, I don't believe it. I still think I'm 16. I was born in Ware, Massachusetts, a small industrial town, and it's roughly between Springfield and Worcester. I lived there with my illiterate Polish grandparents who didn't speak any English.
He came from not terribly warm and fuzzy of anything. His grandmother was good Polish peasant stock, and she just did what had to be done. So the grandson so she has to raise the grandson. Okay, so she's going to do that.
I knew I had a mother because she came at Christmas and she came in the summer. Of course, my mother always had gifts, and my mother was very loving and very good to me, so I knew it was my mother. But I also never missed her because that's what she did. She came, stayed for a while, and then went to New York. As I grew a little older, and you see other kids, I suppose I began to wonder, where's my father? And I noticed at home they never mentioned my father. My biological father divorced my mother after she had gotten pregnant and had me, so I never met him. You know, at that age, you rifle through your parents' drawers. I was home a lot. I think I found the divorce papers then. But there was sort of a detachment. It's as though none of all this had anything to do with me. I fell right into that routine of mine, which was never cracking a book. I don't ever remember cracking a textbook. And keep in mind, a lot of kids had parents that guided them. See, I had nobody like that. That's not an excuse. I probably would have resented it. But my grandmother, grandfather had no conception of the life I was leading in school. None whatsoever.
Because he was in control. He spoke English. His grandparents did not speak English, so they were detached from everything. It was nice that there were a few guardian angels in town that watched out for Norm.
Bob Fox, the principal of the school, another man I'll never forget, because when the senior year started and I wasn't in school, he found out, evidently, that I was hanging out in the town's boys' club. And he called the director and said, have Norman Phillips come up and talk to me. And I went in, and Bob Fox, why aren't you school? I said, well, I flunked last year. He said, well, you have to repeat it. I said, I'm not going to. He said, but you have to. I said, no. I said, I'm 16. I don't have to be in school. So whatever he did, he studied me for a little while. He didn't lecture me, but he pulled out my records and he was going through the papers. And he said, well, let's see. I can give you a quarter of a point for this and a quarter of a point for that. Because I was doing a lot of stuff. I'd decorate the hall for the Valentine's Day dance. I was in this play, that play. In other words, I was doing the things I enjoyed doing. So he said, I can make you a senior if you'll come back. He said, will you come back? I said, yep. Next day I was in school. At that age, 17 or so, you know more than a lot of people think you know. And you can sense adult genuineness or manipulation, couldn't you? But I sensed his complete willingness to see my side of the story. And that was quite remarkable. No lecturing, no shaking finger. You should do this or you should do that. Because that, anybody did that to me would say, and it wasn't a big deal. I didn't realize it till later when the war erupted, when I learned that the Air Corps would take you with a high school diploma if you passed the test. If I hadn't had that damn diploma, I would have been a paratrooper, probably gotten my butt shot down and killed.
But if you don't have somebody saying, hey, like, okay, let's get it together and, what do you want to be doing in a few years? Let's think about that. Let's talk about it. Let's make that happen. just a little nudge of some kind, which the military gives you a big, a big one.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Now, make no mistake about this thing, fellas. We're all going to be in this war soon, sooner than a lot of you realize. And nearly all the officers of this great Army Air Force that they're building today are going to be drawn from the ranks of you men.
Of course, everyone was going. Nobody would dare. My mother, of course, said, "Oh, do you have to go?" and stuff like that. But that's your mother. I applied first to the Naval Air Force, but they turned me down because my teeth didn't bite right. So I was all set to enlist in the paratroops, and a friend of mine talked me into taking, he said, they just dropped the 2-year college requirement. So I was sworn in October 1st of 42, and that began my military career.
That flying was just like magic to him. I mean, he was lucky that he was such a smart guy, and he tested, and he was brave, and he loved that flying, and he just went, he learned that stuff. Yeah.
In 1943, I graduated with my wings and as a second lieutenant. I got onto a victory ship, and we left in a massive convoy. As we drew into Naples, you could sense the tension of everybody. They knew that this is where the war is, in Italy. The Fifth Army was getting battered by the Germans, and our flying units were being hammered. And I can remember pulling into Naples and seeing the smokestacks and prows of ships that had been sunk sticking up through the water, and the bomb damage all along the coastline. And then when we debarked, I remember very vividly still getting on that truck that was going to take us to my fighter group. And there was a smell there too, but it was a smell of dead bodies. And it was very obvious. And kids were lined up along the road, smiling and yelling at the soldiers because we would be throwing out packs of gum and packs of cigarettes to them. As I recall, we were in Ciampino probably a week, maybe 10 days after the Germans left. And you can tell the guys that have flown combat, you just can tell when you go there.
Here, roll this till I get back.
They always said, we separate the men from the boys when the shooting starts. And that's true. You could be a hot pilot. When the shooting starts, no one knows how a person's going to react. Our job was to support the Fifth Army as they grinded their way up the Italian peninsula. All the supplies, keep in mind, came from Germany, through Austria, on the railroads, through northern Italy, down. And so those rail lines throughout northern Italy were our target.
Red Flight gets rid of its long-range wing tanks before the fight. Then down they go.
Strafing, 850s.
So you had 4 50 caliber weapons on either
Yep.
either way.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. Some trains had flat cars with double quads on them, 820 millimeter cannon. The thrill of actually seeing flak, boom, 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 you see these puffs, like popcorn puffs. You don't hear them or anything. They're silent, white, and soft, and they look harmless. But it was really fun. I was hoping we'd see some flak. It's probably like a kid who sees fire the first time and wants to stick his fingers in it.
Those guys would go up and not all of them would come home from a mission. And it might have been your tent mate.
I got hit once outside of Bologna. I had 100 holes in the airplane. And that 88 that hit me, I could hear it. It went boom, and I could hear the metal ripping through the airplane like throwing a handful of BBs on a tin roof. Bring, you know. The plane didn't quit, it just kept flying, so I flew it home. But that could have been close. It's kind of purely luck in a way. Oh, it looks familiar. Can I sit in it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's see.
Left foot in the step,
Yeah.
and then you need a
Yeah,
hand
no,
with that?
I can do it.
Okay.
I'm just going to get my glasses out of the way. Oh, there's the old gun sight. Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Come on. Oh, let's see. Yes, there's prop, mixture control, gear handle with flaps are right here. Yeah. Well, it's not as distant as you think. I can almost hear that burbling engine running comfortably, strong and steady. The 12-ship formation would join up in a tight, close to a line abreast formation. And when the leader rolled, everybody else rolled, and we would all be going vertical at the same time. And then you could see whoever was in front of you, you'd be on his tail. Whenever we bombed a bridge in these small towns, there were always a cluster of houses, because that bridge was invariably in the middle of a small village. And let's face it, when you've got 12 diving airplanes throwing 1,000-pound bombs, if 4 guys hit the bridge, that's pretty good. The rest are going to be near misses, and a near miss would hit buildings. Near the end of the runway, the overrun, the taxiway was dirt, and it had rained and the dirt was fairly soft. So I pivoted, and I had 1,000-pound bomb on me. The wheel went in, I couldn't get it out with full power. So I'm sitting there, and here comes a Sol airplane. So he comes down. Typically, our landing was always on the deck, peel up. So he rolls over my head. I look up, he's got bombs on. I said, that dumb son of a bitch, you're not supposed to do that with bombs on. With bombs on, you're supposed to make a base leg and land so that you don't sling the bomb off. So I watched him turning. There's a slight crosswind. From his side, holding him closer to the runway. So I see his final turn getting steeper, 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 and I can tell what he's doing. He's showing he's going to pull the stick back. And what happens when you do that at low speed? Whoo! He stalled out, flipped over. Boy, I hit the safety belt and I dove out of the airplane. And he crashed maybe 75 feet from me, bounced over my airplane, tore the top of my tail off, rolled down the runway and exploded. And he got hurled out of the airplane, still tied to his seat, and he was laying there, his face all charred, blood boiling out of his mouth as he was bleeding. People ran up to him, they were all standing there. I walked over to him, I said, find out where they bury him so I can go piss in his grave. And I walked away. I didn't mean that, but it had to do with sort of a reaction to a situation that kept me from feeling it too much.
They had to kind of develop a crust, or else why wouldn't you crumble? So you just close off that emotional side to you. And he didn't have too much to close off.
I became an ops officer when I was a lieutenant. I was promoted shortly thereafter to captain, not out of any extraordinary skills, but just because I was willing and able, and I think the guys were willing to follow me wherever I took them. We had plenty of food, you know. It wasn't great, but plenty of roast beef. And at the end of the line, there'd be 2 or 3 little kids with number 10 cans about this big, with a wire handle on they made, standing there to take your scrapings. So the pilots, we all used to grab 6 slices of bread, 4 extra slices of roast beef, you know, we get to the end and give the kids that. It was an exciting time for us because Rome was an exquisite city that had been spared bomb damage by mutual agreement between us and the Germans, which is hard to believe. To a kid, you know, it's romantic. First you're in Rome and in Italy, and then you go to Corsica. Corsica is really physically a beautiful island, and the little villages are beautiful, and the people are beautiful. From Corsica, we started to fly across the peninsula of Italy, go up the Adriatic to avoid the flak, then we'd cut in north of Bologna and hit the long, straight railroads that usually came together at Bologna and then spread out again. We'd try to keep those severed. I can't remember how many times we moved, but we were rarely 2 weeks at one place. We'd pack up and leave. It was hip-hop, hedge-hopping. When we first deployed to southern France from Corsica, our airfield was a little field called Le Luc. In the early fall of '44, when the Germans finally figured that the southern France invasion and D-Day would close up and they'd get caught, the Germans decided to pull out of France, and the Rhone Valley, needless to say, with the Rhone River heading north, all the main highways and railroads were along that. So they packed the roads and we just beat the shit out of them for about 3 days. It seemed like it was about 8 or 10 miles of highway that was just smoking. We knew right there that this was the end for them. I had 72 missions, and the squadron commander asked me, Johnny Newman, and Harry Moreland if we'd like to go home and come back. We said, heck yes. Home for Christmas, why not? That was kind of a revelation, to leave a combat zone and to go back to the States where everything was the way it was, more or less, when you left it. All the young men basically were gone. The town was there. It was sort of like a skeleton in a way. My one friend in the Navy had somehow gotten a minor cut or something on his hand, and it was infected. And I took him to the hospital about 11 or 11:30 at night. And the hospital was locked, but banged on the door, and this nurse came to the door. That was Leona, the woman I married. I got completely swept into her family. I liked everything I saw, in other words. And I think I decided I wanted to become part of it. It goes back to something. I'm in this small town where, raised by Polish immigrant grandparents, and I guess you'd say you're an outsider. I never felt I was an outsider. But here she was, a nurse. That was a take-up. Her father was an engineer. Her brother was a doctor. And she was a beautiful gal who I knew was very bright. And she sparred with me verbally a lot, and that was interesting. So we fell in love. The Battle of the Bulge erupted that winter. I felt I ought to get my butt back. The 27th, keep in mind, came up through southern France. And we were supporting Patton's long tank strikes into Germany. I think we were the first American fighter outfit in Germany. I'm pretty sure we were. There used to be a mission called the Rhubarb. That was when they gave a flight leader four airplanes and a block on the map, which was perhaps, I don't know, maybe 25 miles square, and said, you just go there and fly around and shoot up anything that moves. And we'd shoot up anything that moves. And that meant anything that moves. They were really worried about the P-47s finding them. So if they were ripping down a road, they always parked under a tree. We'd always drop down on the open field at deck level, and we could see the silhouette under the trees. But they would also pull in to farms and get next to barns or next to houses, hoping that you would not risk collateral damage. That term, I don't think, was a term that I ever heard in World War II. There was plenty of collateral damage, and I don't think anybody gave a hoot. Total war is total war. Any vehicle moving, guy on a motorcycle, you don't know whether a car is civilian or not. You'd knock their butts right off the road. Yeah, everybody was an enemy in Deutschland. The squadron commander, I was in the mess hall, said, Norm, launch another 12. 12 guys get together. We briefed about 30 seconds and off we went. We got to Bayreuth, and I saw those airplanes, and I said, wow, let's go bust them up. 4 were strafing, 4 stayed at 6,000 feet, just out of range of the 20s, and 4 stayed about 12 for air cover. So when they shot at us, these 4 their job was to dive right down to gun barrels and silence them. Well, they caught on, they stopped shooting at us, and we started working the field over, and we destroyed 29 airplanes. One guy was in the air trying to get my ass. I was on his tail shooting him, and I hit water injection and firewalled it, and he was about as big as the house in front of me. I pulled up, I was gonna do a roll, and my wingman, I was upside down looking, my wingman was right in his tail, and the guy went boom, blew up. So that was that. So to me, it was just just like a roller coaster ride. So as I say, it had nothing to do with heroism or gallantry. I think it was nothing more than youthful exuberance.
Do you think of yourself as a hero in the classic, war?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. The whole system of recognizing heroism and the medals and all that is all part of a human construct to make people go beyond what they're really capable of. This greatest generation, I think, is a bunch of BS. It's a generation that was there because of our age. And at that age, everybody in that generation got swept in. And that group of people did all the things that any generation would do, swept into the same circumstances. I, for one, I think I can truly say I've never had any regrets. And I know that there are people who have gone toes up, as I call it, because of my actions. So it's not that I'm dismissing it, but it's an acceptance of humanity the way it is, with all its imperfections. When the war ended,
Yeah.
I was airborne. I was flying over Salzburg near Hitler's Eagle's Nest. And at the bottom of the road going up to Hitler's Eagle's Nest was a military compound filled with SS troops. So I was to dive bomb their barracks. And we were just about ready to roll over, and the people on the ground said, "It's all over." So we didn't drop our bombs. We dropped the bombs in Lake Constance. We rolled our way home, raising hell. And of course, got blind drunk. That night, I slung Bob Brown, our squadron commander, who was on the floor, passed out, over my shoulder, and carried him back to the tent and dumped him in bed. And he barfed down my back as we walked through the woods between the bomb craters. The high command issued orders, and they ordered the Air Corps units to send their pilots to the concentration camps. So our pilots from the 27th were put on a C-47, flown to Fürstenfeldbruck, Germany, met with a truck, taken to Dachau, to the prison camp. Otherwise, we wouldn't have seen it. But we saw it, and it's an unforgettable thing. When we got there, by the time we got there, there was a sign outside already, neatly painted, Dachau, and all the prisoners who were physically well enough were still kept behind wire. They didn't turn them loose because they would have slaughtered the German population. But we went in and saw the gas chambers, the piles of hair, glasses, shoes. At that time, I didn't realize how wise it was, but only in recent years, when there are so many deniers, that I realized how smart Eisenhower and the top leaders were. I volunteered for occupation, along with a coterie of my friends. So we ended up in Nordholz, Germany, way up by the North Sea, by Cuxhaven, at an old German airfield. But my primary duty was to guard, because the Germans were cutting through the fences and stealing from the piles of coal that were there, because they were all freezing. And the NCO complained to me. He said, "We yell halt and they just run." I said, "Shoot them." He said, "Shoot them?" I said, "Yeah. Yell halt. If they don't halt, shoot them." The next day or two, bang, they nailed one right through the stomach. Hauled brought him up to the office, and he was in shock. He was shivering. They were going to take him to the hospital, and I wanted to put on the same face I did when that guy crashed, almost killed me. I said, get him off the base. I was a kid. I didn't know how to act.
How old were you?
Well, then in 45, I was 23. So an hour or two later, the physician from the local village came up and pleaded for sulfur drugs. So I said, okay. I relented and let him go to the hospital and get what he needed. We took over for our fighter group a wonderful mansion in Oberneulern, just outside of Bremen. And that was quite an eye-opener for me, because I was a kid that grew up in apartments or houses with no central heat, one cold water faucet, one flush toilet. But in that house, the first night I was there, I stayed in the owner's bedroom and went into his bathroom, and I saw this marble-lined shower with probably 8 or 12 spigots from the side. I had never seen anything like that, never mind a shower in a house. But this one, we had E-boats, a couple of E-boats that were like PT boats. We used those because we had a gunnery range offshore in the water, and we used those for rescue. But on weekends, we'd throw a case of cognac and a case of champagne on it, and we'd go up to Weser River, up to Hamburg. When the occupation forces decided to allow families to join spouses, I called her and said, well, we're going to get married, aren't we? She said, yeah. So I came home, got married, went back to Germany, and 3 months later, she came over. The Christmas of 45, we invited all the kids under a certain age to a big Christmas party. We had ice cream, and we had all the kids, I'd say it must have been 150 at least, plus their mothers. And it was interesting because you could see the kids scooping up the ice cream and having fun. And the mothers, they didn't show hatred, but they were very sullen, never smiled, never looked at us, but were very stoic in herding their little kids there to get their presents and ice cream. It was quite a revealing situation. So, with all our faults, we've got some good-hearted people here. I'd say primarily she was committed to her family. I think the Air Force life was simply something she accepted because that's what I did. Like Leona never joined me in anything. She never skied, never climbed mountains, didn't really like camping, but I liked all those things. So I did them. That's the way it is. For instance, I was a great dancer. Well, Leona was a very awkward dancer. That didn't change anything. She was my wife, but that had nothing to do with me. So I danced with other women. That's fine. Want to climb a mountain? You know, you don't say, oh, gee, do you want to come, dear? I don't know how some people feel. Some women would feel left out and want to come along, and they might have been welcome. But I wasn't doing those things for her or for us. I was doing them for me. I suppose a little selfish, a little self-centered, independent.
The world's fastest plane, the jet-propelled P-80 Shooting Star, is revealed by the Army Air Forces. The P-80 is heavily armed and reaches a speed of nearly 9 miles a minute. with tremendous strides forward in jet propulsion, and even more with the earth-shaking announcement of the atomic bomb, Allied air forces now have undisputed mastery of the enemy.
One of our pilots got lost and landed in Mexico at a little field. Would anybody like to go down and pick up the aircraft? I'll go. So I got in a C-47, went down to Navajoa, and here it is, about a 6,000-foot gravel strip. Temperatures are 100, 105 degrees. Jet would never get off the ground. So there was a captain in the Mexican constabulary that controlled the area. He had about 250, 300 troops, and he spoke English. I said, is there a stretch of road here anywhere? He took me out on this 2-lane asphalt road that was straight. So I said, okay, floor it, go as fast as you can on that road. I wanted to feel. And I said, yeah, I can do this. So we knocked the fence down at the airport, got a farm tractor with some ropes, tied them around the struts of the T-bird, pulled it out, and everybody in town starts to follow us. And hundreds of people, like a big parade behind us. We get out to the end of the road. The captain deployed his soldiers on each side of the runway with orders to shoot cows or people that get in the road in front. I said, once I get going, if I hit something, I'm all done. So I'm lined up and I'm going to start the jet, and the people are all behind me. I keep telling them, but they don't understand. So I said, to hell with it, I'll start it. When they feel the heat, they'll get out, and they did. When you start it and they feel that first heat, whoo, it opened up like a cone behind me. So I just jammed it. So after I took off, I made a big 180 turn, and I smoked down to the roadway, and I just opened it up and started heading for that crowd. And boy, they just diving left and right out of the way. And I pulled up. I had been eating a Mexican meal the night before, and of course, I had no G-suit on, and erupted. So I landed at El Paso, but the crew chief jumps up in the wing and starts to take my parachute. I said, no, I'm going to wear it in. So I walked into ops with the parachute bouncing down my back because I had a big stain about this big on the bottom of my flight suit. So that's what you get for showing off. I pushed to get a lot of jet time. I checked out in the F-86, and a year later I took command of the 22nd Squadron, which I commanded from 55 to 58. It was a 3-year block of time in my life and my career that was memorable to me, because it encapsulated everything I've always wanted to do all my life. And I was surrounded by the most wonderful guys. And among them, Ed White, the early astronaut killed, was my mobility officer in the squadron. Oh, James Salter, his real name is Horowitz, wrote a book while he was in a tutu, didn't tell me about it. It's called The Hunters. It was published, and they made a movie of it, and he's written a lot of books since then. He won the Penn Faulkner Award. Of course, Buzz Aldrin came into the squadron. Everybody's heard about him, and he was a terrific guy. We were in that line of Air Force units in Europe opposing the Cold War Russian threat. And our job would have been to take on any airborne attackers. There's a little scene in the movie The New Head. The pilots are all standing outside, and there's a big black smoke from the runway. They're standing there scratching their heads. And the dialogue is, I hope it was a bachelor. A lot of them, while still young, died in airplane crashes. I can remember Morris Udine went in an F-100, Sailor Matthews, Bill Stair got killed. Yeah, and Cortada and Kelly got killed. And then DeShazer, early on, F-86, conks on final approach, bails out, didn't quite make it. What draws people to automobile racing if there wasn't an occasional whang up, huh? You know, danger is the spice of life. Think about it. Think about life with absolutely no danger, when your heart didn't increase, but it was always the same. It'd be awfully boring. AOCP, aircraft out of commission for parts. So if your airplane is out of commission because you don't have parts, that's a reflection on the efficiency of the supply system. So my squadron broke the Air Force all-time record for AOCPs. General LeMay, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and I guess he heard that some tactical squadron has broken the Air Force. So a four-star general flies down to Bitburg, and he looks at the records, and he puts his finger on something. He says, let's go. Says, you have 3 of these little O-rings. So we went back, and he counted them. He says, okay, Phillips, how many you got under the floorboards? And I said, none, sir, we don't operate that way. And he said, typical of him, with a cigar in his mouth always, I bet you don't. And he walked out. I didn't tell him that we were getting some parts airmail direct from North American Aviation. When we left Tech Supply, my armament officer had just bought a new Porsche, a white Porsche, and it was sitting right outside. I said, hey, General LeMay, have you driven a new Porsche yet? No. I said, come on. And I had an Austin Healey, and he jumped in that Porsche, and we roared off and left all his guards and everybody behind. We went tire squealing around the taxiways.
For 5 frantic days, Budapest is free, and our American cameraman is there to record Hungary's hour of hope and heartbreak. Russian tanks rumble back into Budapest to turn that hope into heartbreak. 5,000 come with 200,000 Soviet troops to snuff out the torch that brave Budapest had held so high.
We converted from the F-86 to the F-156. With the Hungarian crisis, tensions rose, and there was a chance that the Russians might intervene with aircraft.
We set an alert at First and Fellbrook during the Hungarian uprising, and I remember time taking off at First E and head for the border, push the power up, and head for the border and have as many as 30 MiGs come up after us. Needless to say, 2 F-100s against 30 MiGs, it doesn't work. I can remember the radar guys on the ground yelling at us, you got 2 over here, you got 4 at 12 o'clock, you got all these MiGs all over, because they had a lot of MiGs, and we just had a squadron of F-100s, which was ridiculous.
Well, when we got the F-100s, we changed from a pure fighter day squadron to a fighter bomber squadron. And we were the first wing to have the nuclear alert, the nuclear capability.
We were trained and capable of carrying a 1 megaton weapon.
Have you ever seen one? You never have? The Mark 28, which is what, it was the most beautifully machined piece of hardware you ever saw in your life. It was, it was pretty. It really was.
The pilot was the only person who could touch the actual material. And so we had a little bird cage that we would have to take the top off and special tools, and we would actually pick this up and insert it into the weapon.
Our primary mission for all our pilots that were on alert was to hit frontline Soviet air defenses or early warning sites.
We had 5 minutes to get airborne. So you rolled out of bed, you had everything ready, you're putting on your boots, the crew chief is down there with the getting the airplane ready. You jump on that pole and you slide down just like a firefighter.
Like a fireman.
And then you're up in the cockpit of the airplane just like that. While you're doing you're getting everything to start the airplane, your crew chief is fastening your parachute in. And so it's just all teamwork like that. Yeah.
And if you were scrambled and it was a go to the target, that was it. Once you took off and told to go, you went. You needed no further authorization.
Yeah, because once you got the real go,
you're gone.
There wasn't there wasn't much turning back.
Yeah, there's not a no-go.
Yeah.
When you think back about that stuff and some of the insanity, I used to go to deconflicting meetings. The SAC guys were bombing targets, the Navy had nukes that we were bombing targets, the Air Force had nuclear targets, and you tried to deconflict these things so that you wouldn't run into somebody's bomb, and I don't know if any of this stuff is classified or not. And then we always ask the question, well, what happened, if we get there and it's already blown up? And they just said, make a bigger hole. So, if the balloon had ever gone up, I'm sure half the guys would have been so excited they'd probably run off the runway and crash even before they, got airborne.
I'm obviously Polish. And I'm sitting alert, and I got Polish targets, and not that you're born there or anything, but it's the heritage, and you wonder about, man, if I really had to go to war, is everybody bad over there? And how do you separate with a nuclear bomb the good guys and the bad guys? So those little things were always going in your mind.
That's always in the back of your mind.
Yeah.
This is kind of earth-shattering. A lot of people in civilian life don't realize this. On the helmet, they all had a black patch. You could anticipate that the ICBMs from the US would begin to explode. You could get blinded. So when you got close to the bomb line, you flew with an eye patch on one eye.
In case one went off in front of you on the way, you could take this thing off because this eye was going to be blind. To give you an idea of the insanity of it. All wars have an element of insanity in them. And to think about a nuclear exchange at that time between these two great powers with the massive nuclear weaponry that each had, there's no question about it. There's a suicidal quality to it all. And it makes you wonder whether it's worthwhile living in a place where people can think like that. Our alert pilots had a specific nuclear target. The tactic was to smoke in right at treetop level, cross directly over the target, and then pull up.
And you had to keep those two needles perfectly aligned all the way through this maneuver while pulling 4 Gs and at full military power.
When the airplane was roughly vertical, the bomb was automatically launched. The bomb went up reversed and then came down on the target. And the pilot, of course, would roll out at the top into an Immelman, put his nose down, head for the ground, hit afterburner, go supersonic. When his one nuclear weapon went off, he was supposed to be just outside of the bomb blast.
None of us ever thought we would ever get back if we actually made the run into our targets.
Our target was so far into Russia that there was no way that we could get back. Each flight had a patch on their shoulder, and my patch was Einbahnstraße. You know what Einbahnstraße means in German? It's one-way street. I don't know. You know, you start thinking about that stuff, it gets scary. The American public just does not have any idea how close we came to going to war. When you think about that, it's almost like it's, you know, not real.
And so then I made lieutenant colonel, then I went to the Pentagon for 4 years. And that was my first experience with how the huge, massive bureaucracy of the Air Force works. But I used to see full colonels who had reputations that all the fighter pilots knew of them, who retired, and then you'd see them 3, 4, 5 months later in civilian suits, followed by a couple of these ace aircraft department salesmen. That made me uncomfortable. I was at command staff school, and my seminar leader called me aside and said, Colonel Phillips, he said, how would you feel about being General LeMay's aide? I said, I'd cut my throat. So that's a mistake. If I had taken that, I'm sure things would have moved along pretty fast for me, but it wasn't what I wanted to do. See, the Cold War was starting to recede, and the Vietnam thing was on the horizon. I staffed the modification for the F-105, which I had been flying, for conventional weapons. The bomb bay was a bomb bay for a nuclear weapon, but my modification put in a 390-gallon fuel tank in there, and then on the wings, racks to carry multiple bombs of all kinds.
Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara points to bombed-out supply routes from North Vietnam, routes that have supplied Reds in the South with weapons, like this Chinese machine gun, as well as troops trained by the communists. Discounting the possibility of using nuclear weapons, Mr. McNamara says that our air raids have knocked out 24 key bridges. He says these strikes will continue because intelligence reports have confirmed that regular North Vietnam Army troops have infiltrated the South.
I was vice commander training pilots in the 105. It was the mill. It was a pipeline to the war. There were 2 105 wings in Southeast Asia, both in Thailand, one at Korat, one at Tak Lee. The Air Force was short of fighter pilots at that time. The fighter pilots were a small group, and they were grinding through pretty fast. So a lot of pilots who hadn't flown the 105 or hadn't flown a fighter for 10 or 15 years were pulled out of staff jobs and whatnot. All the fighter pilots I knew were always bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and ready to go. And these guys, you could see, were wishing they had retired or something. I saw what was going on. I knew what the loss rates were. I was a different person. I had 4 children then. And I frankly did not feel any of the desire I did during World War II to go fight that war, because I couldn't fathom that the Vietnamese were any kind of a threat to us. There was a lot of vacuous talk about domino theory and all that, and I never subscribed to that. I had read probably more than a lot of people did about Ho Chi Minh, and I knew his history, that he had been in Paris, and I knew that he was a fierce nationalist who wanted to throw off the colonial yoke of France. But of course, because of our long tradition of being allied with France, we sided with the colonial power. So the war wasn't one that appealed to me. The boss called me in and said, do you want to go? I said, no. And he said, well, John Flint got shot down. They really need you. He said, there aren't too many full colonels flying the 105. So your pride gets the best of you. You know, you're collecting the paycheck. And so I was a reluctant volunteer. They wanted me to go immediately. And I said, I'll go, but let me move the family to Amherst and have Christmas. And the Christmas, frankly, I can't remember it, except that it was the typical Christmas in my family where all the kids got presents and we had a nice meal. And Leona was a very calm person. She didn't break down in tears or anything. I was a pretty young full colonel and a fighter pilot, and when it came time to go, I just went. That's all there is to it. Like that, sort of, you know? A little bit of play acting. That's what the uniform's all about, isn't it? But there was definitely a sense of that I've never experienced before, a feeling that I was stepping away from something and stepping into a very dark place. At Korat, the 388th Fighter Wing was the dominant force on the base, and their prime mission was to bomb, strafe, and destroy. The wing commander, I think he died a week after I got there. He had a heart attack. That's when Paul Douglas came in. Very well-known World War II ace, a very seasoned fighter pilot. And I remember his cautionary words. Fundamentally, he said, take it easy out there, Norm. The 105 would go supersonic with full military power, and its top speed was Mach 2.1, so it was considerably faster. The missions, again, were low level, using your radar, finding the target, launching. We always crossed south of the Red Line, over to the South China Sea, and then up over the water, north towards Hanoi. We'd refuel twice going in, because you burn up a lot of fuel in afterburner, getting into formation and climbing, because the thud's really heavy. The 105 is a fairly big, fast airplane, and not suited to finding the truck driving down a road. So a forward air controller would always be operating low, close to the ground. If he spotted the truck, he would call the airborne command post. They'd vector a couple of fighters onto it. When they got into the area, he had smoke rockets. He'd target the truck and shoot a smoke rocket in the vicinity, and then that became the signal for the fighters to get in. And if it was in a missile area, the wild weasels would precede you, and they attacked all the weapons centers, and they stayed there, beating the hell out of the defenses as much as they could till we left. We dive bombed, unlike World War II, where we all got together and rolled over together in this wide-spaced formation. Everybody would dive down at the same time. Hard to believe, because you can have 12 airplanes going probably 650, all from different directions. And it, like that. My wing, the 388th, there's a book written about it called When Thunder Rolled. It notes by aircraft tail number every 105 in two wings at Tockley and the 388th that was shot down. And it was over 100 in 9 months. It's a lot, because there's 75 airplanes in the wing. So, yeah, it was dicey. Typically, a fighter pilot's every night when the hangar doors are closed, so to speak, you line up at the bar and you drink and sing. In the middle of the drunky night, somebody would yell, "Let's sing a hymn to Bob McNamara." And 80 or 90 guys would break out and say, "Him, him, fuck him." He was the antithesis of everything that a military person would want in a leader. And you absolutely felt that what was being done at the behest of people a long way away from what was there on the ground. We would fly by a North Vietnamese airfield and see MiGs sitting in the revetments along the runway, and we weren't allowed on this day, You know, in World War II, it would have been, wow, let's go bust them up. But we couldn't touch them.
The North Vietnamese would go into Cambodia, and you couldn't go after them. You know, they'd go over there and sun themselves and hang out their laundry, and we weren't allowed to go into Cambodia. You know, it's a stupid way to fight a war. You either fight the war or you get the hell out, one or the other.
One of the strange things was to be able to see how the U.S. Air Force could transplant what they had in the States and just put it down in the middle of Thailand, in the middle of Korat, in the middle of the jungle. Korat had a 12,000-foot flawless runway, wonderful airplanes all lined up, maintenance facilities. I had an air-conditioned 2-bedroom trailer with a full-time maid right across the street from the air-conditioned officers club that had a Olympic swimming pool.
Here I am, like a 27-year-old captain and a doctor, so that didn't really count. I mean, I wasn't really an officer, I was a doctor. So the Army nurses made a barbecue one afternoon and invited the fighter pilots. And Norman, thinking that he was still a young guy, even though he was their boss, and he was about 20 years older than the average fighter pilot, was there. And we struck up a conversation.
Doc Blanche is grilling the steaks, and we're all slugging martinis in his trailer. And this 2-star General sidles up to me. I think I was on my 4th martini, maybe. And he said, "Colonel Phillips, how do you think the war is going up there?" And I knew what this was all about, and I resented it. I looked at him. I said, "It's the biggest fucking waste of time I've ever seen in my life." And boy, his face, his jaw almost hit the floor. He says, "That's a hell of a way for you to talk, Colonel, Vice Commander of a fighter wing." I said, "General, I got to go there tomorrow. You don't." You asked me what I thought, and I told you. I picked up my drink and walked away from him. Oh, I can't remember what the last mission was. I remember vividly what went on at the tail end of that mission, because we were coming home feeling very relaxed, and the airborne command post called and asked if anyone has enough fuel, can they go over to these coordinates in Laos and hit this fuel truck? So I and the captain on whose wing I was flying had enough fuel, and we went. The forward air controller was there below us when we got into the area, and he shot that smoke rocket, and we made a long sweeping turn and hit the truck. And I came around feeling a little bit of the old kick I did in World War II.
At Chapone, I was telling you, it's a very dangerous place in Laos, and that's where a lot of roads come together. And but they had a lot of anti-aircraft guns. Norm, I think, was kind of circling around him for a second pass, which is, you don't want to do that in Chapone.
and suddenly a handful of flaming globes came at me like Roman candles. Whoop! And bam! The red lights all came on, and my airplane started to burn. The guy on my wing kept saying, "You're on fire. Get out." He kept saying that, but I didn't want to leave. It's comfortable in that airplane. I could see the jungle coming at me, and the details in the trees started to become vivid. So I grabbed the handles and ejected. Bang, that was it. I went out at pretty high speed. It was high enough so that when the chute opened, it literally exploded. Bam! And I realized I was swinging, and everything was very, very quiet. And then shortly later, I heard a distant explosion, and it sort of reverberated over the rolling terrain. That was my airplane crashing. Just about then, branches started to go through, and I was crashing through the trees. I hit, luckily, on a little bit of a hillside because it rolled me. And as soon as I sat up, I stuffed my dislocated left arm in my flying suit, and I pulled up the antenna with my teeth, and I called the airplane. I said, "I'm on the ground, get rescue going." He said, "Okay." So I got up, and I said, "Well, I got to get out of here because if I shoot orange and white panels, and I hear rifle fire at a distance, but too close." I said, "They're going to come looking for me." So I got up to start walking away, and I took one step with my left leg, and it collapsed. I fell flat in my face, and I broke the antenna off the radio. And I had another radio. I had two radios. I pulled that out carefully with my teeth, reestablished contact, stowed it with my chin, and waited.
It was early afternoon, or mid-afternoon, probably 4:30, 5 o'clock, that we got the call, that we got the scramble.
Well, first, the Sandy, the mission was to prepare the landing zone for the chopper to suppress any ground fire. So they came in and dropped CBUs. That's the small bomb hooks that hit the ground, bounce up about 5 feet, and explode. So they said, "Get your head down, we're going to CBU the hillsides." And so it was just a roar of explosions. And then they left and said, "Call us when we're over," because they couldn't see me. So I listened, and finally I saw the gray hulk go by, and I said, "Now." So they hovered, and they started to load the penetrator. I said, "No, you got to have to send somebody down to get me." So then I see a young airman get on it, and they're coming down, down, down. And he lands.
And I expected just to get off the hoist where he was, get him on the hoist, and be gone. 30 seconds, a minute, whatever. I mean, there was a lot of ground fighting, anti-aircraft, small arms, and I mean, it sounded like the 4th of July.
And I can sort of see him, but he can't see me. See, I was yelling at him all this time, but the chopper thrashing all the leaves and the branches falling, you couldn't hear anything. So I yelled at him. I said, "Get your butt over here." But I, of course, assume he knows where I am. He's going to come right over here. Well, he didn't. He started up the hill this way, and next thing I know, he's circling down the hill on this side. I knew that their procedure is to make a circular search pattern. If they don't find you, they leave. So I took my .38, which was under my left shoulder, and the .38, the first 3 rounds, I believe, were tracer rounds, which leave a tracer when you fire it, to be used for signaling purposes. So this arm was broken, incidentally, and I had a little trouble raising it. So I used my leg like that, and I fired 2 rounds right across the nose of the chopper. The tracers went whipping through there, and they saw that, assumed I was VC firing at them, and they just roared off.
Suddenly there was a muzzle flash and a shot. And I hit the ground, and I hit the ground facing the direction the shot came from. My first inclination was just to put it on fully automatic and spray down the area. But limited ammunition, you're in somebody else's backyard, don't take a chance, you wait till you have a target. So I just sat there, and then he fired again. And when he fired again, I could see a silhouette. It was starting to get darker too. It was starting to get darker, and I could see a silhouette there. And when I saw the silhouette, then I had the enemy, and I sighted down on him and started to pull the trigger. And then I thought, wait a minute, that shot didn't come anywhere near me. Could that be the survivor? And it turned out it was. So that's how close I came to bagging a colonel. But then I didn't know what to do, and so I just yelled. I yelled, "Hey!" And I still had the sight picture. Still had. I wanted him to move so I could kill him and get on with my job. And he didn't move. He held up here. And that didn't have me convinced, because I had it in my head now that this was an enemy, and I didn't know what to do then, and so I moved some bushes with my feet, still keeping the sight picture, and I was waiting for him to either make an aggressive move in my direction, shoot towards me or something, but he didn't, and so I thought, oh, I guess I'm going to have to move, and I kind of backed out of the position I was in. I backed out under some cover, some brush, and got up and came at him from behind, and it was Colonel Phillips. And when I got to him, I took away his 38, and then I lowered my weapon. And it's okay. At this time, I became aware of that an enemy sweep had started, trying to find us. And I could hear sporadic, shots, sporadic, trying to flush. It was coming towards us. And so I got him down behind the log that was there, and I shut off the radio, and we just hunkered down. The enemy sweep came by, and the last man on our end of the sweep I could hear his feet on the ground in the forest, in the jungle, and there'd be a shot. They'd fire a shot every now and then, trying to flush us out, but they swept past us. They just missed us.
So he calls the chopper and says, "Come on back with the penetrator." The chopper said, "We damaged the hoist mechanism." So the gunship, which covers the rescue chopper, is a gunship that follows the gunship, has 3 miniguns, one left, right, one rear. They're 20 caliber guns that fire, unbelievably, 6,000 rounds a minute. And their job is to spray the area and suppress gunfire. So they came down and they dropped a penetrator. Well, they're not a rescue chopper, so it wasn't quite as smooth as the other. They put down a lot of cable. And so the young man's got the penetrator, he's putting it between my legs and apologizing for having to ride up with me. And I say, "Look out, they're pulling it in," because I saw this big loop of cable going like that. And he went like that, and all of a sudden, one ankle, and he was pulled up, dangling by one ankle, up through the trees.
I was trying to get my foot undone, but then it didn't take but a couple of seconds, and I was too high to want to get my foot undone anymore. And as I went up under the second canopy, I reeled in my radio. That was tied to me. And I'm trying to sound calm, hanging upside down under a helicopter being shot at. I was about 20 feet from the helicopter, and I stopped. Okay. And I started going back down again. I was close enough, you could have turned me around. As I hit the second canopy, the lower canopy again on my way down, it slowed me enough that the cable slacked around my ankle, and I fell the last part of the drop to the ground. Colonel Phillips was calling me. He said, I've got it. And I turned around and I looked, and he was clutching a penetrator.
And just a moment later, he came through the brush, and his leg was bleeding, and I think he had a fracture in his arm, but he put the penetrator between my legs, jumped on, and they hauled us up. As we got close to the top, those 3 miniguns were firing. It was just like going under Niagara Falls waterfall, but these are all flames of fire coming down. It felt really good. As soon as we broke out, that chopper honked over in a bank, and away we went, dangling like this, skimming the trees, and I felt euphoric. And they swung you right in through the big door. Big burly sergeant grabs me, and my rescuer, it seemed like an instant later, was jabbing morphine into my leg and giving me water, and I was just laying on the floor of the chopper, happier than can be, because I could see that I got away with it.
He was in the dispensary and being treated for his injuries, and I had to go over there to have my hand looked at and my leg, and so of course I popped into his room but he asked me. He said, you know, is there anything I can do for you? My mother had never entirely bought into this job that I was doing. Like any mother, she was scared and didn't understand it or the need or whatever. And I said, well, maybe you could. I said, maybe you could write my mom a letter, you know, and kind of let her know that what I'm doing is worthwhile. And done, you know. And that letter meant the world to my mom. You know, that she got it, you know, she understood.
He was brought back to the base, I think that day, right?
The next day.
Oscar, he said, you know, I've done this for a long time, and if I heal up and they want me to go back and do it again, I'll do it. But if I never fly another hour, that's okay with me. I don't know whether it was the actual event or more an existential psychological issue where he believed that he was indestructible, and all of a sudden that fiction was destroyed just like that. The next day he was in the officers club in Doc Blanchard's flying suit and with all the plaster underneath and crutches, and he walks into the bar saying, you know, those bastards are not going to get rid of me, you know, and it takes more than a couple of Laotian guys with a radar-controlled 37mm cannon to get rid of this guy.
And I walked into the club, had about 3 or 4 double scotches, and I can remember seeing some of the faces of some of the younger captains sitting there with a very sober look in their face looking at me, you know, and I was all jovial as could be because I was happy I was getting the hell out of there.
He was in bed for a long time, and then he was back in Amherst, Mass, and a retired military guy who was kind of not in great shape at the moment. It would be hard for his first family who had seen him in one super duper macho role, and then poof, nothing. So that may have been, you know, it burst his bubble some. But then he bounced right back.
I was tempted momentarily by a friend of mine that worked for me in the 22nd Squadron to join his business in New York. He wanted me to be his executive vice president.
Some people I felt kind of used him as a, oh, let's see, we're planning a dinner party, so we need a hero. So I guess we'll invite Norm. And
it was in a period when I was considering doing corporate work in New York, and I used to have lunch here calmly and look at the art and think. And then later, when I made the decision, not much later, to go back to college and study art, perhaps moments like this and thoughtful periods fortified that final decision. I'm sure it did. So I marched up the state school and went in, and he said, well, you got to have a portfolio. I said, what was that? So he explained to me. I said, well, Jesus, I don't have a portfolio. And I said, I've taken some courses, I've got good grades. And I told him, well, you got to have I said, listen, I said, you telling me this is a state school in my state, and I enlisted in World War II from this state, fought in 2 wars, you're telling me I can't get into this fucking school? And he said, oh. And of course, I got in. Went to the university, worked with a bunch of young students that I thoroughly enjoyed, exploring artistic ideas, which to me were creative and fresh, and it was a much better lifestyle.
You know, he was a much older guy, and he went to undergrad college with all those cute young girls and walking around campus and in the same classes with him and stuff. He bounced back.
My BFA show, the faculty by then had a lot of respect for me, and they liked what I was doing. And one of the guys in the program said, you ought to take the grad program here. So I did. And I finished in 2 years, and the chairman called me and said, what are you going to do now? I said, well, I don't know, I'll think of something. He said, why don't you apply for this job? We're advertising next week.
We very first met, I was interviewing for a job at the University of Massachusetts, and he was on the interview committee. One March day back in 1977. We were contemporaries in terms of our art development, even though there was such a wide age difference. We both got our Master of Fine Arts within a couple of years of each other.
No question, we were simpatico. We walked around the galleries, looked at a lot of art, and as you do that, two people who are interested in art talk about it. And her thoughts, feelings, and opinions pretty much dovetailed with mine. I was able to charter 49-passenger buses and charge $650 round trip to New York City and have wine and cheese coming back home and donuts and coffee going in. And they were loaded every week. In the beginning, when the students didn't know their way, I'd lead them down the street and
through the galleries.
Into the galleries and show them the ropes, so to speak.
And you would preview the shows, which were important shows for the kids to see.
The center of Soho was 420 West Broadway, where there were 4 very prominent galleries. This was a place to ignite their imaginations. They came home with some fresh ideas, and I think it made them better artists. In the 70s and 80s, this was the belly button of the contemporary American art scene. And I'd see shows by Robert Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, Vito Acconci, and Deborah Butterfield, who made wonderful horses out of strips of rusted steel. Chuck Close, who I got to know pretty well later. Andy Warhol was in his explosive growth at that time. We were sitting in the kitchen. I don't know, it must have been, who knows, 9, 10, 11 o'clock. And she said, I've got a heck of a headache. It really hurts. And she's a nurse. She's not a complainer. I put her in the car, and I don't know at what point, but between Amherst and Northampton, she had a stroke, and one side of her was all stiff, and I drove like hell. I remember at one red light, when I blew the horn, people would move. I put my bumper on the guy's car and drove him right through the light. She never recovered. The kids came up and I left it up to them. Marsh is a nurse practitioner. Susan, Nancy, Randy were there. And they said, pull the plug. And they did. It's not that I'm trying to be different, but for some reason, I seem to be different. My wife died, and typical of me, more than most people, I'm able to put things aside. I'm not a big griever. I think she left Amherst in '80. She was in New York when Leona died. That's kind of funny. And I called her and said, I'm coming down to New York, let's get together. She said, oh yeah, fine. So we went out Friday night, had a nice dinner.
I was dating somebody and he just said, oh, just stop dating that person and marry me.
It's not my inclination to propose to women. It's more my inclination to say, we're going to get married, aren't we?
I came home one night, and there was one of these military channel programs on it. It had to do with supersonic Air Force jets. And it made me think about Norman. And he said, gee whiz, Norman, I guess he's 68. I think it's 68, is well past his life expectancy. And so I got on the phone, and Norman answers. And I said, what's been going on? He said, well, what your first wife's name was?
Leona.
Leona died some years ago, and I married this very young woman who had been on the faculty, because I didn't know anything about his BFA and MFA and faculty positions at the University of Massachusetts. So by this time he had been married 3 or 4 years. He had a 3-year-old son at the age of 68. I mean, it was just mind-boggling.
He's 90 and I'm 80. I ought to be able to keep up with Norm, which is hard to do.
He looks like he's 70. I mean, he's a phenomenon. I mean, there's no question about that.
The main thing is that he's a leader of men. He created character in people like me and others, because the lessons I learned from him, I've carried with me throughout my entire life.
Of all the people that I've ever met, the most alive guy is Norm Phillips. I'm crying.
So he manages to reinvent himself. The fighter pilot, military man, and then the arts teacher, and then now he's the writer.
First thing I normally do is check my emails. I don't dwell on it too long. I get them out of the way. And if I've got any writing to do, I turn on my drag and dictate, and I dictate my writing, and I edit it on the screen, and I print it, and the day goes on. Well, when I started writing about 10 years ago, I got hooked on this prompt system of writing. One that we had recently was in the hole. And the prompts are intended to reach in and stimulate imaginative thinking rather than remembered storytelling. Although 8 or 9 people respond to the same prompt, each one writes something completely different. In getting involved in the writing process, I finally learned to dig into myself and seek the truth of my life, and I saw it for what it was, and so I wrote Throw a Nickel on the Grass.
He just morphs it into something where he can still kind of be a little bit center stage,
it's inevitable that they'll plow me under too. But in the meantime, I like that term, the last man standing. That's my aim, to be the last man standing.